Imagine the Pacific Ocean silent, not calm, empty. No Allied convoys, no radio chatter, just smoke drifting over a harbor that should never have fallen. Japanese naval ensigns hang above Brisbane's waterfront, not raised in celebration, but in control. The city below moves slowly, cautiously, as if every street knows it is being watched. Australian factories stand intact but silent. Their output no longer feeds the Allied war effort. It feeds nothing at all. Across the ocean, Washington realizes the truth too late. Without Australia, the Pacific War has no southern anchor. Supply lines collapse, intelligence dries up, the island-hopping strategy dies before it is born. The war does not end quickly. It rots. Japan does not conquer the world, but it doesn't need to. By isolating Australia, it fractures the Allied alliance and forces a prolonged conflict neither side fully wins. Millions more die. The atomic age arrives darker, angrier, and far less restrained. This future never happened, but in 1942, it almost did, and the paper trail proving it still exists.
By February 1942, the illusion of safety was gone. Singapore had fallen in just 7 days. For decades, it had been described as an impregnable fortress, the keystone of British power in the Far East. When it collapsed under Japanese assault, more than 80,000 Allied troops surrendered. It was the largest capitulation in British military history, and for Australia, it was something worse. It was a warning. The shockwaves hit Canberra immediately. Newspapers stopped speculating about if Australia would be attacked and began asking where. Darwin had already been bombed. Japanese carrier aircraft had struck the northern port with a force comparable to Pearl Harbor. Ships burned in the harbor. Civilians fled south. For the first time, Australians understood that distance alone would not save them. Inside the Australian War Cabinet, the mood darkened. Prime Minister John Curtin faced an impossible reality. Britain was losing ground everywhere. The Royal Navy was tied down in Europe and the Atlantic. The United States was reeling from Pearl Harbor and scrambling to defend Hawaii and the West Coast. Australia stood exposed, vast, sparsely populated, and critically important. It was at this moment that a quiet, deeply controversial idea began to circulate. Not an invasion plan, a survival plan. Later known as the Brisbane Line, it was never a single formal document, but a defensive concept discussed within military circles. The idea was stark. If Japan invaded, Australia would abandon the north. The army would fall back to a defensive line running roughly from Brisbane across to Adelaide. Everything above it, Darwin, Townsville, much of Queensland and Western Australia, would be written off. Industry would be concentrated in the southeast. Ports would be denied to the enemy. Civilians would be evacuated or left behind. It was a plan born not of cowardice, but arithmetic. Australia did not have the manpower to defend its entire coastline. It did not have the aircraft to dominate its skies, and it did not have the naval power to stop a determined enemy fleet. The fear inside Canberra was not that Japan would land everywhere. It was that Japan would land somewhere, and that would be enough. Because Japan's war doctrine was fundamentally misunderstood. Tokyo was not thinking like London or Washington. Japanese planners did not believe in total occupation of massive land masses. Their strategy emphasized perimeter control, capture key points, isolate the enemy, force them into a war of distance and attrition. Australia fit that logic perfectly. If Australia could be cut off, its ports threatened, its northern airfields neutralized, its shipping lanes interdicted, then it would cease to function as an Allied base. No American buildup, no safe harbor, no launching pad for a counteroffensive. The Pacific would tilt. and the Japanese had already demonstrated they could do this. In early 1942, Japanese naval forces swept through Southeast Asia with a speed that stunned Allied commanders. They had coordinated carrier strikes, long-range bombers, and experienced amphibious units hardened by years of fighting in China. Their pilots were veterans, their officers aggressive, their momentum undeniable. The Allies, by contrast, were improvising. Then came a man who would change Australia's role in the war. General Douglas MacArthur arrived after escaping the Philippines, having been ordered out by President Roosevelt. His departure had been framed as strategic necessity. His arrival was staged as destiny. "I came through and I shall return," he had said. Australia became his platform. MacArthur quickly asserted himself as the central figure in the Southwest Pacific. He reorganized command structures. He pushed for an offensive mindset. Publicly, his presence reassured Australians that the United States would stand with them. Privately, the situation was far more fragile. American forces in Australia were limited. Equipment was scarce. Air power was thin. Naval assets were stretched across thousands of miles. The idea that Australia could be immediately defended in depth was more hope than fact. Japanese intelligence knew this, and Japanese planners were watching closely, not asking how to conquer Australia, but how to neutralize it. The line between fear and reality was already thin. All it would take was one decision, one moment, one shift in priorities, and the map of the Pacific would begin to change. In Tokyo, victory created its own problem. By early 1942, the Japanese Empire had expanded faster than its planners had ever anticipated. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, each had fallen in rapid succession. The map in the Imperial General Headquarters glowed with fresh red pins, marking conquests won at astonishing speed. But speed came with risk. Japan was now overextended. Its shipping lanes were long, its fuel reserves finite, its industrial base fragile compared to that of the United States. The question facing Japan's senior leadership was no longer how to win battles, but how to freeze the war on favorable terms before American industry could overwhelm them. Two strategic visions emerged. The Imperial Japanese Army favored further expansion into Asia, India, perhaps even linking up with German advances through the Middle East. The Imperial Japanese Navy saw a different danger: the United States. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood industrial warfare. He knew Japan could not outproduce America. His solution was to build a defensive perimeter so vast and so costly to breach that the Allies would be forced to negotiate. Australia sat just outside that perimeter, and that made it dangerous. From Japanese-held bases in Rabaul and the Solomon Islands, long-range bombers could already reach northern Australia. Submarines prowled the shipping lanes off the east coast. In June 1942, Japanese midget submarines would even penetrate Sydney Harbor, proof that no Australian city was untouchable. This was not harassment, it was reconnaissance. Japanese naval staff studied Australian ports, airfields, and rail networks. They noted the concentration of industry in the southeast. They noted the long, exposed coastline and the limited road infrastructure connecting north to south. Australia was large, but brittle. Most critically, Japan understood Australia's role as a logistics hub. American troops were flowing in, aircraft were being assembled, supplies were being stockpiled. Australia was becoming the springboard for a future counteroffensive across New Guinea and into the Philippines. If that springboard could be kicked away, the entire Allied strategy would collapse. The Japanese did not need Sydney. They did not need Melbourne. They needed to deny the Allies access. This thinking aligned with real operational planning.
In early 1942, Japanese naval staff considered a series of operations aimed at isolating Australia. Advances through New Guinea, seizure of key islands in the Coral Sea, and interdiction of maritime supply routes. One plan, designated Operation FS, envisioned the capture of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, cutting the direct link between the United States and Australia. Though ultimately shelved in our timeline due to resource constraints, its existence proves something critical. Isolation was not hypothetical. It was official doctrine. On the Allied side, intelligence failures compounded the danger. Signals intelligence was improving, but it was incomplete. Allied commanders often underestimated Japanese carrier strength and overestimated their own readiness. Weather, distance, and poor coordination blurred the picture. Then came the Battle of the Coral Sea. In our history, it was a strategic stalemate and a turning point. Japanese plans to seize Port Moresby were halted. Australia remained connected, but the margin was razor thin. Had Japanese carriers not been damaged, had Allied reconnaissance failed one more time, had timing shifted by mere hours, the outcome could have been different, and everyone involved knew it. MacArthur's headquarters understood that Port Moresby was the cork in the bottle. If it fell, Japanese air power could dominate the Coral Sea. Northern Australia would be exposed to sustained attack. Supply routes would become death traps. Australian leaders, watching events unfold, quietly prepared for the worst. Evacuation plans were drafted. Industry dispersal was discussed. The Brisbane Line, never publicly acknowledged, remained a ghost plan hovering in the background of every strategic conversation. The terrifying truth was, no laws of physics prevented Japan from pushing south. No miracle weapon stood in their way. Only choices, only timing, only the outcome of battles that, at the moment they were fought, could have gone either way. The Pacific War balanced on decisions made in dimly lit rooms, far from the men who would pay the price. And one of those decisions was about to change.
Imagine a map on a wall. Red pins, blue pins, thin pencil lines connecting islands most people could not name. In May 1942, those lines converged on the Coral Sea. In our history, the battle that followed became a strange anomaly. Two fleets fought without ever seeing each other. Aircraft struck from hundreds of miles away. When the smoke cleared, both sides claimed losses, and both sides claimed victory. Strategically, the Allies held. Port Moresby was saved. But that outcome was never guaranteed. The switch occurs not with a grand speech or a bold new doctrine, but with weather. Low cloud cover over the Coral Sea lingers longer than expected. Reconnaissance aircraft miss key Japanese carrier movements. A delayed American sighting report arrives hours too late to be actionable. Japanese strike coordination, usually brittle, holds together for once. The result is subtle but decisive. USS Lexington is still lost, as in our timeline, but Yorktown suffers more severe damage. She cannot make Pearl Harbor for repairs. She is out of the next fight. On the Japanese side, the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku escape with lighter damage. Their air groups, battered but intact, are not withdrawn from the operational roster. This single deviation alters the strategic balance. In Tokyo, Yamamoto reassesses. Without the heavy losses that historically forced caution, the Navy does not pull back. Instead, it presses forward. The opportunity is too valuable to ignore. Port Moresby is no longer postponed. It is rescheduled. In June 1942, Japanese forces renew their push south with greater carrier support and tighter coordination. This time, Allied air resistance is thinner. American pilots are fewer.
Australian squadrons are exhausted. The invasion convoy reaches the Papuan coast. Port Moresby falls. This is the moment the timeline splits. With Port Moresby in Japanese hands, everything changes. Japanese bombers now operate from secure forward airfields. Northern Australia is within sustained range. Darwin is no longer an outpost, it is a target on a schedule. MacArthur's headquarters receives the news in stunned silence. His strategy of a gradual counteroffensive collapses overnight. The line he intended to advance along is now controlled by the enemy. Worse, the psychological effect ripples instantly. Australia is no longer a rear area. It is a front line. Japanese submarines surge into the Coral Sea and beyond. Shipping losses spike. Convoys turn back. Insurance rates soar. Supplies that once flowed freely now arrive sporadically, if at all. Inside the Japanese High Command, the debate ends. Isolation will work. There is no need for mass landings across Australia's vast coastline. The enemy is already reacting exactly as predicted, concentrating, hesitating, bleeding resources just to hold ground. Orders are issued for expanded operations south of New Guinea. Not an invasion yet, a tightening noose. MacArthur, watching his carefully constructed plans unravel, faces a brutal truth. If Australia cannot be held as a base, the Southwest Pacific is lost, and the responsibility, fair or not, will land on him. The first Japanese aircraft cross the northern Australian coastline under orders that never existed in our world, and they do not turn back.
The first strikes are measured, deliberate. Japanese bombers do not scatter their attacks across cities. They aim for infrastructure, airfields, fuel depots, port facilities. Darwin is hit again, harder this time, not as a raid, but as a campaign. Runways crater, fuel tanks burn for days. The port becomes unusable. Then Townsville, then Cairns. Northern Australia is not being invaded, it is being neutralized. Japanese aircraft operate from Port Moresby and forward island bases, flying in waves that Allied defenders struggle to predict. Radar coverage is incomplete. Fighter numbers are insufficient. Each successful interception costs aircraft Australia cannot easily replace. At sea, the pressure intensifies. Japanese submarines move farther south than Allied planners believed possible. Merchant ships vanish. Survivors describe attacks in daylight, torpedoes striking with unnerving precision. The eastern seaboard, once thought safe, feels suddenly exposed. The psychological impact is immediate. Insurance companies refuse to cover shipping routes. Civilian coastal traffic slows to a crawl. Military convoys require heavy escorts that the Allies cannot always provide. Every ship sunk is not just a loss of tonnage, but a loss of momentum. Inside Canberra, the Brisbane Line returns, not as a rumor, but as an unspoken assumption. Rail networks strain as equipment is quietly moved south. Factories begin dispersing machinery inland. The government insists publicly that no retreat is planned, even as internal memos use language like concentration and denial zones. General MacArthur pushes back. He argues that abandoning the North concedes initiative, that morale will collapse faster than any Japanese offensive. He demands reinforcements, aircraft, ships, divisions that Washington is reluctant to spare. The United States is fighting on multiple fronts. The Atlantic demands attention. The defense of Hawaii remains paramount. Resources are finite. MacArthur's authority rests on confidence,
and that confidence is beginning to crack. Japanese planners exploit the hesitation. With Port Moresby secured, they expand air operations methodically. Long-range reconnaissance flights map Australia's interior. They identify choke points, rail hubs, and fuel depots. Every piece of data tightens the operational picture. Then comes the next decision. Rather than launch an immediate landing on the Australian mainland, Japan executes a supporting operation. Amphibious forces move to seize key islands along the approaches to Australia, positions that allow sustained air and naval presence. Each capture is small. Together, they form a chain. The Allied response is fragmented. Naval units are stretched thin. Air reinforcements arrive piecemeal. Battles erupt across a widening front, each one draining resources faster than they can be replaced. For Australian soldiers stationed in the north, the war changes character. They are no longer guarding distant outposts, they are buying time. Orders emphasize delay, sabotage, withdrawal. Bridges are prepared for demolition. Fuel dumps are rigged with explosives. The landscape itself becomes a weapon, but also a sacrifice. Civilians watch military convoys heading south and understand what is happening, regardless of official statements. The idea that Australia could be defended everywhere dies quietly. In Tokyo, confidence grows. Reports confirm that Allied shipping is slowing. American troop buildup has stalled. Australia is still free, but it is no longer functioning as a reliable base. The isolation is working. The Imperial Navy does not celebrate, it calculates. Every additional mile of ocean the Allies must cross is another advantage. Every month bought is another factory built back home. Time, for once, seems to be on Japan's side. As winter approaches in the southern hemisphere, the noose tightens further. The stage is set for direct confrontation, not just between fleets, but between strategies. And the next phase will decide whether Australia can remain in the war at all.
The first landings are small enough to be dismissed. At least, that is how the headlines describe them. A reinforced Japanese naval infantry unit comes ashore near the remote northern coastline, far from major cities, far from cameras. There is no grand amphibious spectacle, no armada filling the horizon, just barges, escorts, discipline. The objective is not occupation, it is demonstration. Australian defenders engage immediately. The fighting is sharp and brief. The terrain is unforgiving, thick scrub, heat that drains men faster than bullets. Japanese troops do not push inland. They destroy fuel stores, sabotage airstrips, and withdraw under naval cover. But the message lands. If Japan can land here, it can land elsewhere. MacArthur orders countermeasures. Australian divisions are repositioned northward, even as air cover remains thin. Every movement costs fuel. Every redeployment exposes another sector. The map begins to resemble a patchwork of vulnerabilities rather than a coherent defense. Then the air war escalates. Japanese bombers strike rail hubs feeding Brisbane and Sydney, not to level cities, but to fracture logistics. A single destroyed junction can delay an entire division. Bridges become priority targets. Repair crews work under constant threat, their progress measured in hours before the next raid erases it. The Royal Australian Air Force fights back with everything it has. Losses mount. Pilots who survive speak of Japanese formations flying with confidence unseen since 1941. Their tactics have adapted. They no longer seek decisive dogfights. They trade space for attrition, forcing defenders to respond everywhere at once.
At sea, the situation worsens. Allied naval commanders now must escort convoys not just across oceans, but along coastlines. The number of available destroyers is never enough. Japanese submarines exploit gaps with ruthless efficiency. One convoy is hit just off the Queensland coast. Survivors cling to wreckage in sight of land. The psychological impact is devastating. This is no longer a distant war. It is happening at home. MacArthur presses Washington harder. He argues that losing Australia would unravel the entire Pacific strategy, that without it, any advance toward Japan becomes exponentially harder. He demands carrier groups. He demands priority. Washington hesitates. The arithmetic is brutal. Every ship sent south is one not defending the Central Pacific. The United States is still mobilizing. Time is needed. Time Australia does not have. Japanese planners sense the strain and escalate again, this time with a larger amphibious operation aimed at securing a limited but permanent foothold. The target is not Brisbane, not Sydney. It is a northern port chosen for its isolation and logistical value. The landing succeeds. Australian forces counterattack fiercely, but without sufficient air cover, they struggle to dislodge the invaders. Japanese engineers move fast, repairing docks and extending runways. Within weeks, the foothold becomes a forward operating base. The Brisbane Line, once theoretical, is now functionally real. Australian commanders make the hardest choice of the war. They pull back. Northern defenses transition to guerrilla-style resistance. Regular units withdraw south to preserve combat power. Entire regions are effectively ceded, not conquered, but contested in a way that drains Allied strength daily. MacArthur's position becomes untenable. Publicly, he insists the withdrawals are temporary. Privately, his staff understands the implications. The strategy he championed, advance through New Guinea, strike north, has been inverted. Now he's defending ground he never expected to lose. Japanese operations continue to expand, not through massive battles, but through relentless pressure. Each success compounds the last. Each loss forces the Allies to make another compromise. The war in Australia is no longer hypothetical. It is unfolding in fragments, each one manageable on its own, but together forming a pattern that is impossible to ignore. And the pattern points south.
By the time Allied planners recognize the pattern has already set. Japanese operations no longer feel reactive, they feel synchronized. Air raids intensify along Australia's eastern seaboard, not frequent enough to be decisive, but consistent enough to exhaust defenders. Each attack forces the Allies to scramble aircraft, burn fuel, and expose pilots to attrition. The goal is not destruction, it is depletion. At sea, Japanese submarines adopt a new rhythm. Instead of hunting deep-water convoys, they linger along predictable coastal routes. Fishing trawlers are mistaken for scouts. Merchant captains begin sailing at night, hugging shorelines, slowing traffic to a crawl. Every delay ripples outward. Factories in Melbourne wait for raw materials that arrive late or not at all. Aircraft assembly lines pause, training schedules slip, units preparing for deployment remain idle, lacking transport. Australia is still fighting, but it is no longer accelerating. The United States faces a strategic fork. With Australia increasingly compromised, American planners debate alternatives. Could the Pacific War be fought without it? Could advances be staged directly from Hawaii, from India? Each option multiplies logistical strain and extends timelines by years. MacArthur argues that abandoning Australia would shatter Allied morale across the Pacific.
that it would signal to friend and foe alike that the Allies can be pushed back step by step. His critics point to reality. Resources are bleeding into a defensive posture with no clear endpoint. Every reinforcement sent to Australia disappears into containment rather than momentum. Then comes the moment that defines MacArthur's fate. A major Allied counteroffensive is launched against the Japanese foothold in northern Australia. It is ambitious, risky, and it relies on air superiority that does not fully exist. The attack fails. Not catastrophically, but visibly. Losses are higher than expected. Gains are temporary. Japanese forces withdraw in good order, only to reappear elsewhere days later. In Washington, patience snaps. MacArthur is not relieved immediately. That would be politically dangerous, but authority begins to slip from his hands. Decisions once routed through his headquarters are redirected. Naval commanders receive more autonomy. The chain of command fractures. The pivot character's arc bends. MacArthur, the man of bold promises, becomes associated with a grinding stalemate. His public image remains defiant. His private correspondence grows defensive. Japan seizes the opportunity. Rather than expand south in a single thrust, Japanese planners open multiple small fronts, raids, landings, withdrawals. Each forces the Allies to respond everywhere at once. The Brisbane Line hardens, not as a drawn line on a map, but as a lived reality. South of it, Australia concentrates its remaining strength. North of it, resistance continues in pockets, brave, costly, and strategically limited. Civilians flee south in waves. Roads clog. Housing shortages erupt. The social fabric strains under the pressure of displacement and uncertainty. The pilot cost becomes impossible to quantify. In the broader Pacific, consequences cascade. With Australia constrained, American operations in the Solomon Islands slow. New Guinea becomes a stalemate rather than a springboard. The timeline toward the Philippines stretches further into the future. Japan does not celebrate victory, it measures advantage. The isolation strategy has achieved its purpose. Australia is still allied, but only barely functional. The Allies are forced to fight on Japan's terms, slower, costlier, and spread thin across an ocean that now feels even larger. The war has not been decided, but the initiative has shifted. And once lost, initiative is painfully difficult to reclaim. 5 years from now, the world will look very different because of it.
The map of the Pacific in 1947 looks wrong. Not shattered, not conquered, just distorted. Australia still exists as a sovereign nation, but it no longer anchors the southern hemisphere the way it once did. Its northern half is a scar, officially contested, unofficially abandoned. Japanese forces do not parade through Sydney or Melbourne. They don't need to. Their presence is felt through absence, closed ports, silent airfields, shipping lanes avoided rather than sailed. The Brisbane Line has become a geopolitical fault line. South of it, Australia is crowded, militarized, and exhausted. Cities swell with refugees from the north. Entire communities have been uprooted and resettled inland. The economy functions, but only just. Rationing persists long after it should have ended. Infrastructure projects are designed defensively, not optimistically. North of the line, reality blurs. Some regions are intermittently occupied. Others exist in a gray zone, raided, bombed, contested, but never fully controlled by either side. Japanese forward bases dot the coastline, stripped down and utilitarian. They are not colonies, they are pressure points. Life there is defined by uncertainty. The British Empire never recovers its authority in the region. The loss of Singapore, followed by the effective neutralization of Australia, accelerates imperial collapse. India's path to independence sharpens.
British influence in Asia contracts faster and more chaotically than in our timeline. The United States adapts, but at a cost. Without Australia as a stable logistics hub, American strategy pivots towards a slower, more centralized Pacific approach. Hawaii becomes even more fortified. Island campaigns are fought with greater caution and higher casualty tolerance. The Philippines are retaken, but years later, and at staggering human expense. Japan, meanwhile, survives. It does not win the war outright, but it avoids total defeat. The isolation of Australia buys Japan time to entrench, to negotiate from a position that is no longer desperate. The conflict drags into a tense, grinding stalemate before ending in an uneasy armistice rather than unconditional surrender. There is no clean victory parade. There is no shared relief. The atomic age still arrives, but under darker circumstances. Nuclear weapons are developed in a world already accustomed to prolonged, indecisive war. Their existence hardens borders rather than ends conflicts. Deterrence replaces resolution. Australia emerges traumatized. Its national identity shifts. The myth of distance as protection dies permanently. Defense policy becomes paranoid by necessity. Conscription becomes normalized. The population lives with the knowledge that the continent can be pressured without ever being fully invaded. MacArthur fades from history differently. Not disgraced, but diminished. Remembered as a man who promised momentum and delivered containment. His legend never fully recovers. The war he was meant to win becomes the war that slipped sideways under his watch. The Pacific settles into a cold tension years earlier than in our world. A divided hemisphere, militarized oceans, borders defined by fear rather than peace. And this is only the surface, because beneath the maps and treaties, technology, society, and memory have begun to change in quieter, more unsettling ways.
By the early 1950s, the Pacific has learned a new language. It speaks in bases, in exclusion zones, in ranges and response times. Australia becomes one of the most militarized societies in the democratic world. National service is no longer debated, it is assumed. Airfields lace the southern interior. Radar stations crown hills that once held farms. Cities practice blackouts not as drills, but as habit. Children grow up knowing the sound of sirens. Technological development bends toward defense. Early warning systems, long-range patrol aircraft, hardened shelters. Australia becomes a laboratory for continental survival. Civilian infrastructure is designed with redundancy, dispersal, and denial in mind. The North remains unresolved. Occasional clashes flare along the old Brisbane Line. Japanese positions are reinforced, then thinned, then reinforced again. It is a war that never quite ends, only pauses. Veterans cycle in and out of uniform, fighting the same ground in different years. For Japan, the consequences are double-edged. Avoiding total defeat preserves national sovereignty, but at the price of permanent militarization. The empire contracts, yet never fully relinquishes its perimeter mentality. Political life hardens, dissent is tolerated less. The state defines itself by vigilance rather than recovery. The United States confronts a different legacy. Victory without closure reshapes doctrine. Military planners accept that wars may not end cleanly. Forward bases become sacred. Alliances become rigid. The idea of rollback gives way to containment years before it did historically. The Cold War, when it comes, is colder, more brittle, less forgiving of miscalculation. Global institutions reflect this unease. International law emphasizes territorial stability over moral reckoning. War crimes are documented unevenly. Accountability blurs in the fog of unresolved conflict. In Australia, memory becomes contested terrain. The Brisbane Line, once denied, enters public consciousness as trauma rather than policy. Families remember evacuations, abandoned towns, years spent waiting for a push north that never came. The idea of national unity fractures along geographic lines. Trust in distant allies becomes conditional. Self-reliance becomes doctrine. And across the Pacific, a lesson settles into the collective mind of a generation. A nation does not need to be conquered to be defeated. It only needs to be isolated. This world is not defined by flags planted on capitals, but by lines never meant to exist, drawn quietly, defended desperately, and remembered forever. The war ended, but history did not heal, and the distance between what happened and what almost happened is far thinner than comfort allows.
History is fragile. One cloud over the Coral Sea, one delayed reconnaissance report, one battle fought differently. That was all it took to bring Australia to the brink of collapse. The world could have been reshaped not by an extraordinary weapon, but by timing, weather, and the decisions of a few men. Imagine what else could have happened. Could MacArthur have turned the tide if reinforcements arrived earlier? Could the Allies have held Northern Australia with different priorities? Or was the continent's vulnerability inevitable, a product of geography and logistics? The Brisbane Line, once whispered in back rooms, becomes a haunting reminder. Nations can be endangered without ever being fully invaded. The map of the Pacific was almost rewritten. Millions of lives hung on a thread thinner than anyone could see. It forces us to ask, how many other moments in history teetered so close to disaster? How often do chance, delay, or misjudgment decide the fate of millions? History is not immutable. It is a chain of choices, and sometimes just one choice determines the world. If you found yourself questioning what could have been, consider subscribing. We explore these fragile threads of history because understanding how close disaster comes teaches us to value the world as it is.